I could still taste the metallic tang of blood coating my tongue when I shoved open the rusted metal door of the tattoo parlor at 11:30 at night. 40 minutes earlier, my father's drunken outburst had split my lower lip open, his calloused knuckles cracking against my jaw, hard enough to leave a throbbing bruise blooming beneath my skin. Before I'd even made it home to face him, Kaylee Ross and her crew had cornered me behind the school bus stop, shoving me into a jagged chain-link fence, yanking at my hair, and sneering that a broken girl like me deserved every bad thing that came her way. No teacher intervened. No neighbor glanced out their window to check on the shouting. No one in this dead-end Ohio town cared that at 16, I had nowhere left to run, no one left to ask for help. The autumn wind sliced through my thin, oversized hoodie, carrying the sharp stench of damp asphalt and stale cigarette smoke from the alley. My backpack strap was torn, my palms scraped raw from catching myself on the concrete, and every step I took sent a dull ache shooting up my ribs. I'd walked 3 miles in the dark, past boarded-up storefronts and flickering streetlights, heading for the only place everyone in Havenbrook warned you to avoid, Ink Haven Tattoo. The locals whispered about it like it was a haunted house, a den for trouble, run by a man with a violent past and zero patience for anyone's mistakes, Jackson Hale. They said he'd fought his way out of street gangs, done time, and chased off grown men with nothing but his fists and a cold, unforgiving stare. Parents told their kids to cross the street if they saw him coming. Neighbors locked their doors when his motorcycle rumbled down the block. He was the town's resident ghost story, a boogeyman everyone feared, and he was my last hope. I pushed the door the rest of the way open, and a thick cloud of warm tobacco smoke and pine-scented disinfectant wrapped around, muffling the distant hum of traffic from the main road. The shop was dimly lit, only a single pendant lamp casting golden light over the black leather tattoo chair and scattered ink tray. The walls were lined with faded flash sheets, skulls, roses, script lettering, half obscured by smudges and years of work. A low, gritty rock track played softly from a beat-up speaker in the corner, quiet enough to feel like a secret, not a performance. The floor was scuffed concrete, sticky in spots from spilled sanitizer, and the air hung heavy with stillness, the kind of quiet that makes your heart race instead of calm. I froze in the doorway for a long second, my shoes hovering just over the threshold. I'd rehearsed this walk 100 times on the way here, practiced the words I needed to say, but now that I was inside, my lips stung every time I breathed, and my hands shook so bad I could barely grip the crumpled bill tucked in my jeans pocket. This was stupid, reckless, a desperate kid's last-ditch gamble with nothing left to lose. Normal girls didn't walk into a notorious tattoo shop after midnight to beg a dangerous stranger for protection. Normal girls had parents who loved them, friends who stood up for them, safe houses to go home to. I was normal. I hadn't been normal. A low voice cut through my racing thoughts, rough and unamused. No hint of warmth. Shawsed. My gaze snapped to the back of the room, where a man leaned against the metal workbench, one shoulder propped against the wall, his forearms crossed tight over his chest. Jackson Hale looked exactly like the store promised. Sharp jawline, stubble dusting his jaw, dark hair messy and falling just above his shoulders. His arms were covered in layered, faded tattoos, old and new ink blending together to map out a history I'd only heard. He wasn't big in a bulky, intimidating way, but he carried a quiet, coiled strength, the kind that told you he'd survive things most people couldn't imagine. His eyes raked over me slowly, scanning my split lip, my scraped hands, the way I hunched in on myself like I was waiting for another blow to land. No surprise flickered across his face, no pity, just a calm, unblinking assessment, like he saw broken kids wander in here more often than Eve. I swallowed hard, tasting blood again, and forced forward. Each step was shaky, my legs burning from the long walk, my nerves screaming at me to run. I stopped a few feet in front of his workbench, too scared to get closer, too desperate. My fingers fumbled in my pocket, twisting and tugging until I pulled out a single $10 bill, crumpled beyond recognition, edges frayed, paper thin from being folded and unfolded 100 times over. It was all I had left in the world, all the allowance I'd saved from doing odd jobs for the elderly on the street. Every penny I'd managed to keep from my father's. Held it out to him, arm trembling, the bill fluttering in the faint breeze. "I heard you take protection money," I said, my voice cracking halfway through the sentence, small and raw and utterly pathetic. I'd meant to sound brave, firm, like I knew what I was doing. Instead, I sounded like exactly what I was, terrified 16-year-old girl lifeline. I have $10. I want to buy your protection. Silence hung thick in the shop for several long beats. The music faded into the background, the distant traffic noise vanishing entirely. Jax pushed off the wall slowly, his movements deliberate and unrushed, and toward me. The light hit his face then, and I could see the faint scar slice through his left eyebrow, a leftover mark from whatever fights had shaped his brutal reputation. He stared down at the crumpled $10 outstretched hand, then lifted his eyes back to my face, focusing on my swollen lip, my glassy eyes, the fresh bruises peeking a hoodie sleeve. A dry, humorless laugh rumbled in his chest. "Low and rough. You're kidding, right?" he said, his tone sharp with disbelief. "You walk into my shop at midnight, beat to hell, and offer me $10 for protection?" I didn't lower my hand. I didn't dare. If I backed down now, I had nothing. No plan, no escape, no way to survive the next day, the next week, the rest of my life trapped in that violent house and tormenting school. My chest tightened, tears burning the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I'd cried enough, begged enough, never cared before. "It's all I have," I whispered, staring straight into his eyes, begging him to understand without saying the words. "I can't go back. I can't do this alone anymore. Please, please protect me." Jax's gaze lingered on my face for a long time, the amusement in his expression fading slow, replaced by something darker, quieter, unreadable. He didn't move to take the money. He didn't turn me away either. He just studied me, like he was trying to figure out how a kid so young could already be so broken, so completely out of options that walking into a stranger's tattoo shop to buy safety, only logical choice. Finally, he reached out. His fingers were calloused, scarred at the knuckles, warm when they brushed mine as he took the crumpler bill from my grasp. He smoothed it out between his thumbs, flattening the endless creases, staring at the worn paper like it wasn't just pocket change, but a contract. Ow, my breath caught in my throat. Hope, fragile and burning, flared to life in my chest for the first time in years. He folded the bill neatly once, twice, and slipped it into the front pocket of his black flannel shirt, patting it once like he was sealing something unspoken into place. His eyes locked back on mine, hard and steady. Laughter, no more mockery. "You know what this means, kid?" he asked, his voice lower now, serious, every word weighted. "Once I take this money, the deal doesn't break easy." I nod fast, too overwhelmed to speak, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't care how hard the deal was. I didn't care what strings came attached to it, thing over the hell I'd been living. Jax exhaled slowly, a quiet, resolute sound nodded once in return. "Fine," he said, "under my protection now." I turned to leave a minute later, my legs still shaking, my injuries still throbbing. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel afraid. The bell above the door jingled softly, stepped back out into the cold night air, the alley dark and empty around me. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement, and the wind bit at my bruised cheeks. But as I walked away from Inkhaven Tattoo, my hands tucked tight in my pockets, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I'd paid $10 for a single night's safety. But in that dim, smoke-filled shop, with a broken girl's last penny and a dangerous man's quiet promise, I'd accidentally signed a deal behind us both for an entire decade. A $10 contract that would rewrite every part of my broken life, for better and for far worse. The walk home that night felt unreal, like I'd stepped out of a never-ending nightmare and into a fragile, untrusted calm. The cold Ohio wind still stung my bruised jaw, my ribs ached with every shallow breath, and the taste of old blood still lingered on my tongue. But for the first time in years, I wasn't scanning every shadow for danger. The empty alleyways, the flickering streetlights, the quiet suburban houses with locked doors and dark windows, none of it felt threatening anymore. I carried a secret now, a dangerous, impossible secret. I was under protection. The town's most feared man had taken my $10 and promised to keep me safe, and even through the numbness and the pain, a tiny, stubborn spark of hope lingered in my chest. I slipped into my house through the back screen door an hour before midnight, moving silent as a ghost. The living room lamp was off, the television muted, and my father was passed out on the couch, an empty beer bottle rolled across the floor at his feet. His heavy, drunken snores rumbled through the quiet room, proof he'd already burned through his rage for the night. He didn't lift his head, didn't check to see if I'd come home, didn't care that I'd fled into the dark hours earlier. I crept straight to my tiny bedroom at the end of the hallway, clicked the door shut soft enough not to wake him, and leaned back against the wood, finally letting myself breathe. For days after that midnight deal, I waited for the other shoe to drop. I told myself Jackson Hale wouldn't follow through. A $10 promise meant nothing to a man with a violent reputation, a man who'd seen every kind of desperate lie and stupid bargain the world had to offer. I'd been naive, pathetic, foolish enough to believe a stranger could fix the hell my life had become. Every morning before school, I braced myself for Kaylee's taunts and shoves. Every night before bed, I waited for my father's drunken outburst to start again. I expected no mercy, no reprieve, no quiet days. I expected the same endless cycle of pain I'd always. But things started to shift, slow and silent, almost too subtle to notice at first. On Monday morning, Kaylee and her usual group circled my locker like they always did, their mean smiles sharp and ready to tear me down. I tensed, gripping my textbook tight, preparing for the insults, the shoves, the way they'd corner me until the hallway cleared out. But before they could say a single word, one of the girls froze, her gaze drifting over my. A second later, Kaylee's smug expression faltered. She scanned the hallway behind me, jaw tightening, and after a long, tense beat, she snapped at her friends to follow her. No taunts, no shoving, no cruel comments. They just left, like something unseen had scared. I stood frozen in the empty hallway, my heart racing, confused. There was no teacher nearby, no administrator, no one who could have. Nothing had changed except their sudden, uncharacteristic hesitation. It was the first time they'd ever backed down from me with. That evening, my father came home drunk again, his mood dark and volatile the second he stepped. He slammed his truck keys on the kitchen counter, yelling about his terrible shift at work, about how everyone in town was against him, about how his life had fallen apart for. I hovered in the doorway, shoulders hunched, waiting for him to turn his anger on me like he did. He glanced my way, his eyes bloodshot and furious, and for a split second, I saw the familiar rage bubbling up in his gaze, but paused. His stare lingered on me, sharp and calculating, and he finally just grunted, grabbed another beer from the fridge, and stumbled back to the living room without laying on me. No blows, no shattered glass or slammed doors, just quiet, unspoken restraint. That was when I knew it wasn't coincidence. Jax was keeping his word, not with loud threats or violent outbursts, but with quiet, invisible power. He was working in the shadows, twisting the edges of my broken life to keep the worst away. And no one could figure out why their usual cruelty had suddenly lost. By Wednesday, the entire dynamic of my daily life had shifted. Kaylee's group avoided me entirely, crossing the hallway when they saw me coming, no longer daring to corner me after class or leave cruel knocker. My father still drank relentlessly, still muttered bitter insults under his breath, but he never raised his fist again. The constant, suffocating fear that had followed me every single day for years finally loosened its grip on my chest. For the first time in my teenage life, I could walk through the hall without flinching, come home dreading the night, breathe without waiting for the wave of harm. But peace was fragile, paper thin, and I asked. My father wasn't a man who stayed calm for long, and Kaylee wasn't the type to quietly. They weren't scared of me. They were scared of whatever was standing behind me, unknown. And fear always turned to resentment, given enough time. They weren't fighting me openly anymore, but they were watching, waiting for the invisible protection to fade, plotting quieter, crueler ways to hurt me looking. I grew paranoid, hyper-aware of every dare in the hallway, every muttered whisper from my classmates. The quiet safety I'd craved for so long didn't feel like a gift, it was a time bomb. I kept replaying Jax's words from that night in the tattoo shop, the quiet warning that didn't break easy. I'd thought he meant I couldn't back out. I was starting to realize he meant the consequence stick to me forever. My only friend Mia noticed the change immediately. She watched me through school unharmed, watched me avoid my path, watched my father leave me untouched day after day. The rumors started small at first, quiet murmurs between classmates, side-eyed glanced questions. By midweek, everyone in our grade was whispering about the quiet, bruised girl only become untouchable, who'd found some mysterious, dangerous guardian in the shadowed alley. Mia pulled me aside last period on Friday. her voice shaky and nervous, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds to make sure no one was listening. Her eyes were wide, a mix of fear and judgment, the same to give me. "People are saying you're hanging around the tattoo guy," she whispered, her tone tight with worry. "Lila, everyone knows he's dangerous. They're saying you owe him something bad." I opened my mouth to deny it, but no words came out. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't explain the $10 deal, the midnight visit, the quiet keeping me alive. The truth sounded crazier than the rumors, so I just stood there, silent and guilty, and watched deeper into her eyes. By the time I walked home that evening, the sky was dark, streets quiet and empty. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a single silent vibration that made my breath catch. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling, stared at the blank text screen. No caller ID, no saved number, just a single message staring back at me, plain and unmarked. "Don't walk back alley after school." The message was short, cold, anonymous, no signature, no explanation. But I knew exactly who it was from. No one else watched over me this closely. No one else cared enough to warn me about what one else could see. I stared at the words for a long time, my chest twisting with a kind of gratitude and terror. The safety I'd bought wasn't free. It wasn't casual. It was constant, watchful, unyielding, and it was wrapping my life tighter and tighter into the dark, unforgiving one I'd paid to save me. The quiet peace I'd found was only the calm before the storm, and I could feel the chaos lingering just out of sight, waiting to crash everything I'd barely gained. I heeded Jax's anonymous warning text without hesitation. For a full week, I stuck strictly to bright, busy streets on my way home, carefully avoiding the shadowed back alley he'd forbidden me to take. A fragile, unnatural calm settled over my life. Kaylee stopped openly harassing me, and my father held back his drunken outbursts. But the tension across Havenbrook only thickened daily. Everyone sensed the peace wouldn't last, held in place by some unseen, unnameable force, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything broke loose. The breaking point came on a rainy Friday night, 1 week after Jax's warning text. School let out early for a teacher training day, and I stayed late to finish a makeup test, leaving campus long after everyone else. Dark storm clouds rolled in fast, dumping cold, relentless rain over town while thunder rumbled in the distance. Running late and desperate to beat the worsening storm, I made a reckless choice. I took the forbidden back alley shortcut. The narrow, cracked alley sat between abandoned storefronts and overgrown fences, the exact spot Jax had warned me to avoid. Rain blinded me as I hurried through puddles, foolishly believing no one would lurk out in the terrible weather. I was dead wrong. Kaylee and 2 of her closest friends were waiting for me at the alley's dead end. They'd skipped school early and laid a deliberate trap, hidden by the rain and free from adult supervision. After a week of seething silently while I walked unscathed, they were ready to take out all their pent-up frustration on me. "Look who finally decided to stop hiding," Kaylee called over the patter of rain, her voice sharp and venomous. She stepped forward, blocking my only exit, her eyes blazing with jealous rage. "You think you're untouchable now? Got some mysterious man watching over you?" My heart plummeted. I'd been so careful all week, only to ruin everything with one impulsive mistake. The isolated alley was empty, far from homes and traffic, leaving me completely trapped with no one to hear me cry out for help. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice tight with panic, rain dripping down my face and mixing with the faint, old bruising still lingering on my... Kaylee laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Not a chance. You've been floating around school like you're better than us, like you're protected. I'm gonna find out exactly what you're hiding. And if your little guardian's watching, let him see how easy it is to..." They advanced fast, cornering me against the wet brick wall. One girl snatched my backpack off my shoulders and tossed it into a mud puddle, my textbooks and phone sinking into the murk. Another shoved me hard against the concrete, my shoulder slamming into the rough brick, a fresh burst of pain shooting through my ribs. Kaylee leaned in close, her face inches from mine, ready to tear into me with words and fists. Before she could lay a hand on me, a low, authoritative voice cut through the rain and thunder, sharp enough to freeze every one of us in place. "Take one more step." The 3 of them spun around in shock. I lifted my head, my breath catching my throat, and saw Jax standing at the alley entrance, silhouetted against the faint. His black motorcycle jacket was glistening with rain, his dark hair damp and stuck to his forehead, and his entire posture was coiled, unyielding, dangerous. He didn't yell. He didn't aggressively. He just stood there, his cold eyes locked on Kaylee, and the air in the alley shifted instantly, thick with unspoken threat. The whole town painted Jax as violent and ruthless, but in that moment I didn't see him. I saw the only person in this town who'd ever shoved me. Kaylee's confidence crumbled in an instant, but she tried to salvage her pride, lifting her chin in a chance. This isn't your business. She's just from this town. She's under my protection. Jax cut her off, his voice flat and final. That makes it my business. All of it. One slow step forward from Jax sent the three girls stumbling back, terrified. They'd only heard rumors about him before, and his quiet, unshakable intensity was far scarier than a gossip. Leave. Now, ordered. Kaylee didn't dare argue. With one last furious glare thrown my way, she turned and fled down the alley with her friends hot on her heels, their footsteps splashing through puddles until they vanished into the rainy darkness. The alley fell dead silent, save for the drumming of rain on pavement and the distant. Jax's gaze softened faintly at the sight of my shaken, soaked state and my mud pack. He stepped over, lifted my water bag from the puddle, and squeezed out the excess rainwater. I told you not to take this, he said. No anger in his tone, only disappointment. I stared at my shaking hands, tears burning hot in my eyes despite the cold rain soaking my face. I was late. I didn't think anyone would be here, he nodded, like he understood the stupid, desperate impulsiveness of a kid just trying to survive. He slung my ruined backpack over one shoulder, then gestured alley exit. I'll drive you home. His motorcycle waited around the corner. I climbed on behind him, hands trembling as I gripped his jacket, and we rode my neighborhood. For a brief, precious moment, the town's judgmental whispers faded his protective shield, but didn't last long. When we pulled up to my house, the front porch light was blazing bright. My father's truck was parked haphazardly in the driveway, and he was standing on the front steps, staring straight at us, his furious. He and the motorcycle pull up. He'd seen me climbing off the back of a stranger's bike, soaked and shaken. He'd seen Jax. I froze on the sidewalk, dread crashing over me. This was the confrontation I'd feared since my $10 contract. My father's long, restrained fury, finally exploding directly at the man protecting me. Richard Marlowe stormed down the steps, his boots thudding hard on the wooden planks, alcohol fuming off his breath even from several feet away. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, every ounce of his suppressed rage unleashed now outside himself. "Who the hell are you?" he barked at Jax, stepping between us like he was shielding me from a predator, twisting to suit his own anger. "You think you can show up at us hovering over my daughter? You think I don't know what people say about you? You're a criminal, a street thug." Jax didn't flinch. He stood tall, unapologetic, his gaze steady against my father's furious outburst. "I'm the one keeping her safe while you're too old to do it yourself." The words hung sharp and unforgiving in the rainy air, shattering every lie my father told himself about being a wronged man. His face flushed with rage, fists clenching, ready to lash out physically for time in weeks. "You don't get to come into my house, my town, and disrespect me," Richard snarled. "This is my... You stay away from her." Jax leaned in slightly, his voice low and lethal, a quiet warning only my father could fully hear. "I don't stay away. Not anymore. You lay a hand on her again. You yell at her again. You make her fear coming home, one you answer to now." The warning was clear and absolute. My father heaved, rage warring with primal fear. For months he'd preyed on my helplessness, but now he who feared nothing and no one. For the first time ever, I watched my father back down from a fight. His shoulders slumped, his jaw tightened, and his rage clear, seething resentment. He wouldn't apologize, dared not strike or escalate further. The fake, fragile peace between father and daughter completely in that moment. There was no more pretense of a normal family, no more quiet tolerance. He knew I had protection now. He knew I no longer had full control over my pain. Jax's eyes flicked to me in a quick check to ensure I was steady. Then he turned and left without waiting for thanks or praise, vanishing down the rainy street. He'd stopped the immediate danger, our messier future in its wake. Alone on the wet sidewalk, staring down my father's unbridled hatred, I finally understood the cost of my $10 deal. My safety was no longer quiet and hidden. It was public, confrontational, and it had turned my father into my most relentless enemy. The Monday after the Rainy Alley confrontation, the entire high school buzzed with rumors. No one had seen the exact fight. No one knew the full truth of what had happened that night, but fragments spread fast. Someone spotted Jax's motorcycle outside my house. Someone else caught sight of Kaylee and her crew storming out of the back alley, red-faced and furious. By first period, the whole student body was whispering the same thing. Lila Marlowe was tangled up with the dangerous tattoo guy from the edge of town. The gossip wasn't just casual hallway chatter. It turned cruel, sharp, and personal. Classmates muttered that I was paying Jax off for special treatment, that I was sneaking out to the shop after dark, that I had some messed-up secret arrangement with a grown man everyone feared. No one stopped to wonder why I needed protection. No one asked about the bruises that still faded slowly from my skin, or the nights I'd spent hiding from my father's rage. They only saw the abnormal, terrifying connection I'd formed, and they judged me for it relentlessly. Kaylee fueled every lie, feeding into the chaos with quiet, calculated remarks. She never outright lied, never got caught spreading rumors, but she dropped hints to anyone who would listen. She claimed I'd been stalking her, that I'd called in a violent stranger to intimidate her, that I was too weak to fight my own battles and too desperate to care who I dragged into my mess. It was a perfect reversal of the truth, and everyone ate it up. The worst part was losing Mia, my only real friend. For years, she'd been the only person who'd sit with me at lunch, who'd text me on hard nights, who'd never joined in the bullying. But the second the rumors exploded, she pulled away fast. She stopped saving me a seat in class, stopped replying to my texts, and crossed the hallway whenever I walked near her. I saw the fear in her eyes every time we made eye contact. She wasn't mean. She was scared. Scared of being associated with me. Scared of getting tangled up in my drama. Scared of drawing Kaylee's wrath and the shadow of Jax's dangerous reputation onto herself. I couldn't blame her. In a town as small and closed off as Havenbrook, one wrong association could ruin your entire social life. I was already broken, already an outcast. She still had a normal life to protect. Still, the isolation cut deeper than any bruise. Overnight, I became completely alone. No friends, no allies, no one to defend me against the endless whispers. The only person keeping me safe was a man I could never talk to, never acknowledge, never thank without stirring up more. At home, the atmosphere turned icy and suffocating. My father never raised his hand again, just as Jax had warned him not. But his silence was far worse than it. He didn't speak to me, didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my existence except to shoot me bitter, hateful glares every time we occupied the same room. He resented my newfound safety. He hated that I'd found someone stronger than him to hide behind. Every meal was tense. Every quiet minute at home felt like a ticking tom, waiting for him to find a new way to punish me without laying a hand on. Trapped between school-wide judgment and my father's unspoken hatred, I grew desperate to fix my crumbling reputation. I just wanted to be invisible again. Not protected, not feared, not whispered about, just sorry. I craved the quiet, unnoticeable life I'd once hated, because at least it hadn't come with endless shame, and that desperation pushed me to make the worst decision of my teen. I decided to push Jax away entirely. I told myself I didn't need his protection more. The bullying had stopped, my father stayed docile, and the immediate danger was gone. The price of his help was too high. Social ruin, isolation, a life permanently marked by association with a I convinced myself that if I cut all ties with him, the room would fade, people would stop judging me, and I could piece my normal life together. It was a selfish, foolish, short-sighted judgment, rooted entirely in fear and teenage insecurity. I didn't stop to consider that the peace I enjoyed only existed because of him. I didn't realize how quickly the old crew would return, the second his watchful. That night, I pulled out my phone and stared at the anonymous number that had sent me. My thumb hovered over the screen a long time, my chest tight with guilt. This man had saved me twice. He'd stood up to my violent father, scared off my bullies, and kept his $10 promise without asking more. And I was about to erase every trace of him from my life. Cowardice. Pressed delete. I erased the number entirely, wiping the only direct line between us, my phone. I vowed never to walk near the tattoo shop again, never to glance his way if we stood on the street, never to acknowledge the deal that had saved my life. I would be independent, invisible, and free from the judgment that haunted. What I didn't know was that Jax had been watching me long. He'd seen her spiral, pull away, seen the way I shrank at school, seen the guilt and fear in my eyes every time of him. He'd watched me distance myself silently, and he'd misread every single actions. He didn't see a scared from shame. He saw a girl who'd outgrown his protection, a girl who was embarrassed to owe her safety to a man with a ruined past, a girl who no longer wanted anything to do with the dark danger came from. By the time I fell asleep that night, a thick unspoken rift had settled between us. The invisible thread that had tied me to my only protector was fraying fast, and I was the one holding the scissors. I'd thought cutting him off would save me. Instead, I was stripping away the only shield I had against a world that had never to me. As I lay awake in my dark bedroom, the house quiet and my father asleep down the hall, a hollow, uneasy emptiness settled deep in my chest. The fleeting calm I'd fought so hard grasp felt thinner than ever, and a quiet, gnawing dread began to creep in. I'd broken the only bond that had ever kept me safe, and I had no idea how devastating consequences would be. Months slipped by in a quiet, fragile haze after I deleted Jax's number. I kept my word to myself, steering clear of the tattoo shop street, staring straight ahead if our paths nearly crossed, and erasing every small reminder of the $10 contract that had once saved me. Slowly, the school rumors began to fade. Kaylee stopped targeting me, her hunger for drama shifting to new underclassmen to torment. Mia started sitting near me in class again, tentative and careful, like she was testing whether associating with me was finally safe. For the first time in years, I blended into the background, ordinary and unremarkable, exactly the life I'd craved. My home life settled into a cold, hollow routine. My father never touched me again, but the silence between us thickened into something heavier than anger. He avoided me, working late most nights, staying drunk on the porch until dawn, his resentment a constant, unspoken weight in the walls of our small house. Without his violence to fear every day, I could breathe, but I never felt at peace. I knew the calm was artificial, sustained by a protection I'd willfully abandoned. I threw myself into my studies, desperate to outrun my life in Havenbrook. Graduating high school and leaving town became my sole obsession. I buried my guilt over Jax deep down, convincing myself I'd made the right choice. I was a kid, I told myself. I'd been scared. I'd had every right to shield myself from the town's judgment and the shadow of his dangerous reputation. It was during my final semester of senior year that I accidentally uncovered the first piece of the truth I'd never been allowed to see. I stayed after school for a college counseling meeting, lingering in the empty parking lot long after the last bell, and overheard two veteran teachers talking near the faculty entrance. They thought no students were left, their voices low and unguarded, free of the filtered stories the town told to scare kids. They were talking about Jackson. I'd spent years hearing only the worst versions of him. The violent delinquent, the gang fighter, the dangerous outsider who didn't belong in Havenbrook. But their conversation was nothing like the gossip. They spoke quietly with sorrow, not. They recalled how Jax had been only a kid when his own father nearly beat him to death. How he'd bounced between foster homes with no one to fight for him. How he'd gotten in street fights not out of cruelty, but because he'd never been taught any other way to. My feet froze to the pavement as I listened, every quiet word unraveling the lies I'd believed for years. The teachers said Jax had cleaned up his life entirely, opening the tattoo shop to stay grounded, to distance himself from the chaos that had defined his. He never bothered innocent people, never hunted for trouble. All the town's terrifying stories were exaggerated, blown out of proportion by people who feared what they didn't understand. More than that, they whispered that Jax had stepped in more than once over the years to protect abused kids no one else gave. Quiet interventions no one ever acknowledged, thanked. A sick, twisting guilt coiled tight in my chest. For years I'd seen him as a threat, a shameful secret, a dark mistake I needed to erase from my life. I'd pushed him away out of fear and embarrassment, convinced his darkness would eat me. But all along, he'd been the only person who'd recognized me, the only one willing to stand between me and the world that kept breaking me. He hadn't saved me for money, or for favor, or for some hinda. He'd saved me because he knew exactly what it felt like to be a scared, beaten kid with. I stumbled to my afterward, my hands shaking too badly to grip the steering wheel. All my childish justifications crumbled away. My $10 had never been enough to buy protection. It had never been a real transaction at all. It had just been a desperate kid's excuse. A tiny lifeline he'd chosen to grab onto so he could save me without fanfare, without questions, without expecting. I dug through my old that night, searching until my fingers brushed against the crumpled $10 bill I'd kept years. It was faded, creased beyond repair, soft from being folded and tucked away for safekeeping. Staring at it, I finally understood the weight of his quiet warning, taken it. The deal easy. He hadn't been about himself, talking about me. He'd known I'd carry that packed long after it. I graduated a month later, packed my car with whatever little belongings I owned, and left Havenbrook without its back. I enrolled in a state university 2 hours away, determined to build a new life far from his bitterness, far from Haley's cruelty, far from the guilt I carried over abandoned. For the first few years I flourished. I made new friends, built a steady routine, earned my degree, and landed a stable entry-level office graduation. I grew independent, confident, finally free from the bruises and the fear that had childhood. I almost forgot the girl 16. I almost forgot Jax entirely, rarely visited home. I texted my father once every few months out of obligation, never longing to return, never missing the cold, empty house that like mine. I convinced myself I'd healed, that I'd outgrown my trauma, that my old life no longer wore over me. I thought Then the phone call came, sudden and uninvited, late Tuesday night. It was a local Havenbrook hospital number, the tone sharp over the line. A nurse informed me my father had collapsed from a severe alcoholic overdose, rushed into emergency care, unresponsive, and in critical condition. They needed me to come home immediately to sign paperwork and make medical decisions, next of kin. My entire new stuttered to a halt. For half a decade, I'd built distance between me and my past, burying every scar and every memory deep down. Now I was being pulled straight back to the town I'd spent years escaping. There was no one else to go, no one else to take responsibility. I had to return. I drove back to Havenbrook at dawn the next morning, my car cutting through the quiet, tree-lined road for so long. The town looked smaller, older, down than I remembered. The same boarded storefronts lined the main street, the same flickering streetlights hung over empty sidewalks, the same heavy, stagnant to every corner. Every mile closer chipped away strength I'd built in the city, me back to the scared used to be. When I turned down the familiar side street leading my childhood neighborhood, my heart in my throat. Down the dark, forgotten alley, tucked between the empty storefronts, the neon Inkhaven tattoo sign still glowed faint in gray morning light. It was still there. He was still there. All the buried guilt, all the unspoken regret, all the unanswered questions I'd spent years running from crashed over a brutal wave. I'd come back to face my father's mistakes, but I instantly knew there was no escaping the other uneasiness I'd left behind. The $10 deal, the quiet decade-long protection, the boy who'd saved me, pushed him away. Everything was still waiting in a broken little town. And before I could even the weight of returning home, I spotted a familiar figure at the bus stop up ahead. Kaylee Ross, older but just as sharp and unforgiving, leaning against the cold, knowing stare. She was still here too. My old nightmares hadn't vanished with my new life. They'd just been waiting for me to come back. Kaylee's cold, knowing stare pinned me in place the second I rolled to a stop on the empty street. Time softened around the edges, and for a split second I was 16 again. Small, hunted, and waiting for the cruelty to start. She hadn't changed, not really. The sharp edge of her bitterness was still carved into her features, the quiet hunger to dismantle me still burning bright in her eyes. Years hadn't dulled her resentment. It had only let it fester, waiting for the day I foolishly came back to Havenbrook. She pushed off the bus stop fence and sauntered toward my car, slow and unrushed, like she had all the time in the world. I locked the doors on instinct, my fingers trembling against the button, a useless, childish defense. She leaned down to my driver's side window, her gaze sweeping over my clean city clothes, my neat hairstyle, the quiet composure I'd worked half a decade to build. A bitter, mocking smile tugged at her lips. "Look who's home," she drawled, her voice low and sharp. The girl who ran away and thought she was better than this town, thought she was better than everyone she left behind. I didn't respond, my jaw tight. I knew better than to engage. Kaylee thrived on reaction, on breaking the calm I'd fought so hard to maintain. But her next words sliced straight through my silence, sharp and unescapable. You think you got to escape clean? All because some tattooed thug took pity on you? Everyone still talks about you, Lila. The poor beaten girl who bought herself a guard dog with pocket change. My blood ran cold. I'd spent years convinced the old rumors had died out, that people had moved on, that my past was buried behind my new life in the city. But Kaylee had kept it alive, nursing every old whisper, every twisted lie, waiting to weaponize it the second I returned. She'd never forgotten how Jax had stripped her of power all those years ago, how I'd walked away unscathed when she'd wanted to break me completely. I don't live here anymore, I said finally, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I'm just here for my dad. Kaylee laughed, a hollow bitter. We don't get to leave our mistakes behind. Not in this town. You think he forgot about you? Jax said. He's been here all these years, waiting. Why? She stepped back from the window, her eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction, and tossed one final line before turning to walk away. Enjoy your homecoming. All your old ghosts are still. I sat frozen in my car long after she vanished around the corner, my chest heaving. The calm confidence I'd built in the city crumbled entirely, leaving only guilt and unease in its wake. I'd come home to handle my father's medical crisis, but I'd instantly walked straight into the unresolved wreckage of my. I spent the next 2 days camped out at the Havenbrook Hospital, signing endless paperwork, consulting doctors, and sitting by my father's unresponsive bed. He lay pale and still in the sterile room, monitors beeping softly beside him, a shell of the angry, violent man who'd defined my childhood. For the first time, he was completely helpless, and the strange, conflicting mix of relief and sorrow weighing on me felt heavier than any anger I carried. Between hospital visits, I stayed cautious, avoiding the alley with the tattoo shop, sticking to main roads and crowded streets. I told myself I just needed to get through these few days, settle my father's affairs, and leave again, permanently. But fate had no intention of letting me run. On the third evening, I stopped at a small downtown convenience store to grab coffee snacks, and I saw him through the. He was leaning against his motorcycle parking lot, wearing the same worn black jacket I remembered, his frame taller and leaner than I recalled, his features sharper with age. The tattoos covering his arms were still visible beneath his sleeves, faint and familiar. He was staring straight at the store entrance, like he'd known I would be here, like he'd been waiting. My breath caught. For 5 years I'd avoided every thought of him, erased every trace of him, convinced myself I'd moved on. But one look at his face, and every buried memory crashed back. The rainy alley, my trembling $10 bill, his quiet promise, the way he'd stood between me and every harm I faced. I forced myself to walk outside, my steps hesitant. When my shoes hit the pavement, his gaze locked onto mine, unblinking and intense. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, no blame, only a quiet, exhausted understanding, like he'd spent years in the moment. I stopped a few feet away, my voice whisper. Hi, Jax. He nodded once, his tone unrushed. You're back. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, simple and final, carrying every unspoken word between us. Years of silence, guilt, abandonment, and unacknowledged gratitude. It's in the hospital, I explained quickly, like I owed him an excuse. I had to come home. Jax's expression softened faintly. I'm sorry. The quiet sincerity in his voice cracked open every wall I'd built around my guilt. I stared at him, finally brave enough to ask the questions I'd buried for half a decade, the questions I'd spent years cowardly to face. Why did you do it? I asked, my throat tight. Why did you protect me? For $10? Was. Jax pushed off his bike, shifting his weight, his gaze drifting to the empty street like he was staring into old memories. I saw myself in you, he said simply. Scared, no one in your corner, fighting to survive a life that was already breaking you. I was that kid once. No one saved me. I'm gonna let that happen to you. My eyes burned with unshed tears. All my childish fears, my selfish choices, my desperate attempt crashed over me. I pushed you away, I admitted shakily. I deleted your number. I avoided you. I acted like you were something to be ashamed of. I'm so sorry. Jax didn't rush to forgive me. He didn't dismiss my mistake. He just studied me quietly, his tone steady and honest. I knew you were scared. Kids in this town don't survive being tied to people like me without getting burned. I didn't blame you for wanting normal. But you stayed, I argued, my voice breaking. You still protected me even after I was off. Why? That was the question that unraveled everything. The question I'd never dared to ask. The question that held all the $10 contract. Jax fell silent for a long moment, the distant the only sound between us. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, heavier, carrying the weight of years of quiet never once considered. The summer after you graduated, he began slowly, I had a job offer out west. A friend opened a shop in Portland, offered me a full partnership, a new start, far away from this town and all its ghosts. I was gonna leave, for good. My heart stalled in my chest. But I stayed, he continued. I turned it down, because Kaylee was still here. Your father was still here. I knew the second I left, all the things you'd escaped would come crashing back down on you. You were miles away, building your new life, and you didn't deserve to hide by the ghosts you left behind. Tears spilled down my cheeks, hot and unrelenting. I'd thought I'd paid a small price for my freedom. A few awkward memories. But Jax had paid my cost for me. He'd sacrificed his own escape, his own fresh start, his own chance to leave his traumatic past behind, just to keep my old nightmares at bay. $10 had never bought protection. It had bound him to me. For 10 years, he'd carried my burdens alongside his own, quietly sacrificing his happiness for my safety, never asking for credit, never demanding gratitude, never letting me see the price he'd paid. I had no idea, I whispered. Bro, I never knew you gave up so much for me. Jax isn't, steady and unwavering. The deal wasn't about the money, Lila. It was never about the money. It was about giving a kid a fighting chance. You took it, you grew. That was always enough for me. In that parking lot, years of lies, self-deception, and cowardice crumbled completely. I'd thought I'd outgrown trauma, that I'd healed and moved on, but I'd only ever been protected. I'd only been safe. Person had chosen to bleed for my peace. All scattered fragments of the past clicked into place. The teacher's quiet stories, his endless patience, the anonymous warnings, the unbroken safety I'd enjoyed for years. Every loose thread, every hidden detail, every broken sacrifice finally made sense. $10 contract was never a transaction. It was a vow, a 10-year vow he'd kept faithful, even when I'd abandoned him entirely. Now, standing face to face with the truth, I knew the final chapter was no longer about escaping my past. It was about finally facing it, making amends, and settling every last debt I owed, before a long promise finally expired for good. 10 years. That was how long my $10 contract with Jackson Hale had outlived my pain, my fear, and the broken girl I used to be. What began as a desperate child's last plea for survival had quietly grown into the longest, most loyal protection no one in this cruel little town had ever bothered to give me. Now, after a decade of hidden sacrifices, silent watching, and unspoken forgiveness, every loose thread of my past was ready to be tied closed. I stayed in Havenbrook through my father's slow recovery, putting aside my city life to finalize every loose end I'd spent years running from. For the first time in my life, I did not flee from my trauma. I stood against it. And I started with Kaylee Ross, the girl who'd once made my school days a living hell and spent years feeding vicious rumors about me and Jax to anyone who would listen. I found her lingering by the old school bus stop, the exact spot where she'd cornered me years ago, where my endless cycle of bullying had felt impossible to escape. She was older, but still sharp-spoken and bitter, stuck in the same small-town resentment that had defined her youth. When she spotted me walking toward her alone, her lips curled into a mocking sneer, expecting to intimidate me the way she always had. No scary tattooed bodyguard to hide behind today, she taunted. I stopped directly in front of her, calm and unyielding. No trace of the trembling, terrified kid she once knew. I don't need him anymore. I never truly needed him to defeat you. I just needed to grow out of the fear you spent years trying to lock me in. I told her plainly that her rumors, her petty cruelty, her endless attempts to ruin my reputation had never broken me. They'd only taught me resilience. I made it clear her power over me had died the day I chose to stop letting her live in my head. Kaylee's arrogant grin faded completely, replaced by stunned silence. For a decade, she'd clung to the story that I'd only ever survived her harassment because of a dangerous man's interference. Today, she finally understood the truth. I had survived because I was always stronger than her cruelty. With no ground left to stand on, she turned and walked away, defeated for good, her hold on my story permanently broken. Next, I faced the man who'd broken me. When he woke fully from his overdose, The fog of alcohol finally lifted, leaving him sober, frail, and painfully aware of every violent mistake he'd made. There was no anger left in his eyes, no reckless rage, no cruel resentment, only hollow shame and exhausted regret. For years, I'd dreamed of hearing an apology that would fix all my old wounds. But standing in that sterile hospital room, I realized I no longer needed his absolution. I spoke softly, but firmly, closing the chapter on my childhood abuse. I survived every beating, every silent night, every hateful word you ever threw at me. But I am no longer the child you hurt. I'm not here to blame you, and I'm not here to forgive you. I'm here to free my... His eyes filled with helpless remorse, but he had no words left to defend himself. I arranged his long-term care, settled every legal and medical obligation, and walked away from the house that had once felt. I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, my father's violence and neglect no longer owned. With Kaylee's bullying and my father's abuse finally laid to rest, every shadow from my past gone. All. The man who'd spent 10 years catching me when the world tried to break me. That night, I returned to the narrow, dim alley where the Inkhaven tattoo sign glowed warm against sky, no longer a beacon of hope, but a symbol of a decade's quiet kindness. The second I stepped beneath the shop's awning opened, Jack stood in the doorway, exactly as he'd stood 10 years before, but there was no skepticism, no amusement, no distant caution in his eyes, only quiet. I pulled the crumpled, worn $10 bill in my pocket, the same bill I'd clutched trembling at 16, the only money I'd had. After 10 years of being folded, tucked away, and preserved, it was faded, creased, and frayed at the edges, the physical proof of our long fight. The 10 years are over, Lee. Jax's gaze fell to the bill, then lifted back to me, steady and unreadable. What does that mean for us? I smiled, lit and unburdened, free of the guilt and fear that had haunted years. It means the protection contract ends tonight. I don't need you to shield me anymore. I've learned to stand on my own, but it also means I finally get to stop. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and laid out every truth I'd spent years too afraid to acknowledge. I told him I knew about the Portland shop offer he'd turned down, the new life he'd sacrificed just to stay in this dead-end town and keep my old nightmare back. I told him I knew the anonymous late-night warnings, the quiet tensions at school, the subtle threats that had kept my father and Kaylee at bay for an entire decade were never a $10 deal. They were part of a kind. You never did this for the money, I whispered. You did this because you saw a broken kid who no one else would save, and you refused. Jax's expression softened completely, the hard edges he'd carried for melting away. I took your $10 that night, because it was the only way a scared kid would accept help. The money was never the price, it was the excuse. In that moment, every last hidden detail fell into place, every buried phobia fully resolved. The town's cruel rumors that painted Jax as a violent thug were nothing but ignorance covering a gentle, loyal heart. The anonymous texts that had kept me safe were the quiet watch of a man who never wanted credit. The $10 bill I'd clung to for years was never a transaction. It was the start of a sacrifice. The future Jax had abandoned was the cost he'd for my freedom. He took the old bill from my fingers, holding it gently like it was precious, worthless change. He crossed the shop and slipped it into a small glass frame hanging on his wall, nestled among old tattoo sketches and faded photos, an official, permanent part of his shop's story, his life story. Our story. The contract is finished, Jack said, turning back to low and sincere. I don't have to protect you anymore. You don't have to, Reed, stepping closer. But I get to choose you now. Not as a bodyguard, not as a deal, as someone I want freely. A faint, genuine smile tugged at his lips, the first true smile I'd ever seen from him. I've been yours for 10 years, Lila. I'd like to keep staying. I walked out that night transformed. The dark passage that once symbolized fear, desperation, and helplessness now symbolized redemption and growth. I was no longer the girl who'd begged a stranger for her last $10. I was a woman who'd healed, who'd overcome her abuse, who'd outgrown her bullies, and who'd finally saved her. The protection deal had expired, but the love, gratitude, and quiet future it had started was only just beginning.